The spring rain came down in broad silver sheets across the Montana territory, turning the wagon ruts into slick ribbons of mud that cut through the hills like wounds on green cloth. Caleb Marlowe folded his collar up against the downpour and peered through the sheen. An iron gateway rose before him, ornate work, looping letters hammered tall enough to earn an impression on the sky. Marchwood. He checked the soggy slip in his pocket again. Ashby Ranch, the merchant in Billings had said, though the ink had bled into ghostly gray. He scowled. The man had been 2 whiskeys deep when he gave directions. That explained a lot. Caleb looked down at his own boots, caked with months of travel, at the patched elbows of his wool coat, at the leather satchel clutched under his arm. He'd spent the last 12 years in the high country, trapping through winter, guiding hunters through summer ridges, keeping to the edges of civilization ever since that violent chapter in Denver had shoved him toward solitude. The money had run low. When old Pete at the trading post mentioned a rancher needing a custom bit and bridle taken south of town for a favor, Caleb had taken the $5 fee as if it were a lifeline. Thunder rolled, then cracked overhead as he pushed the gate. His boots made soft squelches in the mud along the long drive. The main house ahead looked less like a ranch home and more like a transplanted manor. White columns, broad porches, a grace that belonged to a different latitude. He climbed the steps, leaving a line of muddy prints across the pale boards, and knocked on the heavy door. The sound carried in that formal, echoing way that makes a man aware of how small he is. A woman opened the door, gray dress, silver hair pulled into a tight bun. Her expression was sharpened stone. "Deliveries are for the back," she said without invitation, eyes taking in his boots as if cataloging exactly how much offense they would inflict upon the floor. "Beg your pardon, ma'am." Caleb tipped his hat. "I've a delivery addressed to Ashby Ranch. Merchant in Billings sent me—" He held up the slip. The woman's eyebrows climbed. "Ashby Ranch burned 3 seasons ago," she said plainly. "Mr. Ashby left for California after his wife passed. You've come to the wrong place." Before Caleb could reply, a new presence moved through the doorway and into his field of vision, and for the first time the morning felt less like a courtroom and more like possibility. She was tall without being strikingly so, with dark copper hair caught in a practical knot that let stray wisps soften the hard line of her face. Her gaze, green and incisive, fixed on him with a steadiness that felt like being measured for an honest saddle. "Agnes," she said, with a small smile that suggested the world might mend itself one right action at a time. "Let him in." The woman, Agnes Whitcomb, scowled but stepped aside. "He's wet, enough to rinse a pail. Come in while you decide whether to head back to Billings." Caleb wiped his boots on the mat and tried not to make another mess of it. The foyer showed off white plaster and polish. Every muddy footprint he left was a little crime against taste. As he followed his hostess through to the fireside parlor, the house seemed to inhale and accept him. He offered his hand, introduced himself. Caleb Marlowe, guide, trapper. Merchant said the Ashbys wanted. He showed the ornate bit and bridle, silver chased with roses and thorns, leather dyed a dark noble burgundy, too fine for these plains. The woman, Lydia March, ran her fingers along the tooling like someone reading a text. "Morrison ordered from St. Louis," she said. $47, fancy. She gave a small, bemused shake of the head. "A fair sum to spend on a horse's mouth." Before they could trade more than cautious introduction, the parlor door burst open and a round man in a flour-caked apron barreled in, carrying a pot of stew. Milo Harper, the cook, a man whose enthusiasm outpaced his coordination, tripped on an oriental rug and sent the pot arcing through the air. Steam and gravy described a perfect parabola and then shattered silence and crockery with equal zeal. The stew splattered across the mantel, the floor, and, with merciless accuracy, Lydia's sleeve. Agnes made a sound that might have been a reprimand, while Milo flopped to the floor like an apologetic seal. Lydia laughed, a clear, unexpected sound that broke tension into shards. The 3 of them began to clean, and Caleb found himself wiping gravy from Lydia's cheek with a handkerchief. The contact, quick, practical, left him more unsettled than any mountain storm. "You came all this way in this weather," Lydia said, once the worst of the mess was tacked down. "Sit by the fire and tell me about that bit." Caleb unrolled his story. Wrong directions, tired pockets, a merchant too fond of whiskey. Lydia listened, coffee cup warming her hands, slipping questions like fishhooks into the conversation to test his answers. She was a rancher through and through, hands calloused, boots muddied, sharp with the sort of intelligence that made Caleb feel unsheathed and honest. When she spoke of the ranch she tended, thousands of acres, herds scattered across mesas and river bottoms, she showed a spine built by hard winters. $47 for tack, Lydia mused. You should have sold it and taken the money. I thought someone deserved something beautiful, Caleb said simply. Lydia watched him then, the sort of look that read a man's map of scars. We're short a foreman. My man left. The one I hired after him turned out to prefer the saloon to the pasture. I'm 2 weeks from roundup. I need steady hands. Her offer came with the sort of bluntness ranchers use to avoid wasting time on sentiment. 2 months trial, through roundup and summer grazing. $50 a month, board and lodging. Do the roundup, fix the water lines, and be presentable at the society table when necessary. Succeed, and the offer rose to $75 a month and permanent place. Caleb stared. $50 seemed to him like a fortune carved out of a bad winter. He'd slept in thinner places. I'll accept, he said after a long pause, then, with a smile that surprised Lydia, added his own clause. 3 nights of perfect, unbroken sleep as his wager. If he earned them, Lydia would grant him an evening, quiet, uninterrupted, of whatever piece he chose. A proper dinner, a dance, conversation by lantern light. It was a personal wager, a small rebellion against the hard-scrabble life. Lydia's eyes softened for the briefest of beats. She accepted. They shook on it. It felt to Caleb like sealing a promise with leather in hand. The foreman's cabin was small and clean, with a hearth and a bunk. Milo, with the zeal of the well-fed, promised to keep Caleb's belly full. Life on Marchwood settled into a rhythm. Caleb's hands, accustomed to ropes and trigger winds, learned new things. The cadence of cattle grazing, where the streams lay fat with spring melt, which calves needed steadying. The water system repairs taught him to coax springs into life. The men who worked for Lydia learned to trust him because he was steady as a gate hinge. Most surprising of all were evenings. Lydia relaxed in ways she never showed by day. She taught him to read soil and ledger, to move from the habit of solitude to the quick repartee that made her laugh. She slept better, she said once. The dark under-eyes eased, the sudden flinches at stray sounds less frequent than before. He'd started with the wager in mind. Somewhere during 2 long spring weeks, he'd started to care about the woman under the rancher's hat. One evening, a storm tore off a length of fence along the eastern boundary. Caleb rode out to assess the damage and realized the job demanded at least 2 hands. He returned at dusk to the light of the barn and found Lydia kneeling by a mare's hoof. We'll do it together, she said without hesitation, shrugging out of her dress and into trousers and a flannel shirt that sat on her like armor. The closeness required by the wire and post, shoulders brushing, breath held in small synchronous beats, slid them into a kind of private choreography. Hands over hands, his arms bracketing hers as they wrestled stubborn wire into place. You have to ease it in, Caleb murmured, leaning close enough that she could feel the warmth rising through his wool coat. She let him guide her. The lantern light made the barn sacred, cast their work into iconography. When the final twist settled and the wire held, Lydia exhaled and turned to him. The distance between practicality and something heartfelt was only as wide as their hands. He kissed her then, soft, careful, unlike the rough, quick kisses he'd known in saloon rooms. She answered with the kind of surety that came from a woman who'd learned to pick her risks. Milo re-entered at that moment with the deliberate clumsiness of a man in love with chaos, tripping over a coil of rope and sending hay flying. Laughter finished the moment for them both. The fragile peace was tested within a week. Sebastian Vale, polished hat, polished manners, and the sort of wealth made from buying water rights, rode up to Marchwood as dusk bled away. He was a tall man, with a smile that had been signed by practice. "Mrs. March," he said, voice like smooth whiskey. "I noticed the lights. Having trouble?" Lydia introduced Caleb as her new foreman. Vale's interest sharpened. His invitations were sugar-coated threats. He pressed a sit-down invitation. The Cattlemen's Association dinner at the Grand Imperial that coming week. He meant it as a test, Caleb realized. A chance to sow humiliation in public and weaken Lydia's standing in the water rights talks. They attended. The Grand Imperial glittered like a promised city. Caleb wore a borrowed suit that fit as well as a man's past fits, snug across the shoulders, unfamiliar at the collar. Vale's allies clustered like gulls. The evening's decorum turned into a field of barbs. A seam split in Caleb's jacket mid-course, as if tailored to embarrass him. The wine at his place was cheap, a banker's joke on a working man. Yet every attempt to make him look ridiculous turned oddly in his favor. A misplaced dance card led him to lead a scramble of children in a simplified Virginia reel, and the room's laughter, once pointed at him, shifted into warmth. A cheap wine was revealed to be an odd vintage desirable to a particular palate. A $30 bid on a doily, an honest mistake, became a generous donation to the orphanage. And when Vale rose for a parting barb about the novel of a mountain man overseeing domestic animals, Milo arrived with a cake on a silver tray that would have been an ornament at any ball. He tripped. The cake swung. It struck the chandelier. Frosting rained down on Vale like a coronation of ridicule. Laughter freed the room. Vale left with dignity as damp as his coat. The weeks that followed warmed into summer. Caleb did as promised. Roundup went smoother than Lydia dared hope. The water pump was coaxed to steady life, and the cattle thrived. Lydia slept once, twice, thrice, without waking, and by the third night she kissed him in the kitchen and said, "You've earned that evening." The evening she gave him was simple and perfect. A garden lit by lanterns, a table set under the apple trees, a roasted bird wrapped in herbs. She had banished Agnes from the kitchen in a fit of domestic conspiracy and served bread kneaded by her own hands. They spoke of Denver, that quiet ache inside Caleb's bone. "I killed a man," he said one night, the words flat as a R-board. He'd been beating his wife. He came at me with a knife. It happened. The law called it self-defense. The brothers of the dead man called it a stain. I left. She did not flinch. She only folded her hand inside his and said, "Then you chose another life. So did I. We choose what we build." Later, under the stars, he took from his pocket a small brand, 2 letters entwined, a horseshoe around them. "I want to be more than your hired hand," he said. "I want to be your partner." 3 weeks later, they married under an arch of wild roses on the south lawn. Milo, with great care, managed not to ruin the arch, and the territory came to watch a union that felt less like merging of property and more like the closing of an open wound. Sebastian Vale remained long enough to offer a toast ringed with polite venom, and was promptly soaked with a pitcher of lemonade courtesy of Milo, who insisted on public gratitude for his balance training. Time, which had been a keep-it-together exercise for Lydia and a persistent companion in Caleb's life, softened into something generous. They hyphenated the ranch gate, March Marlowe, not merely a name change, but the carving of a new map. Lydia's sharp business mind and Caleb's steadiness made the ranch prosper. He improved grazing rotations, trademarking a system that kept pastures renewing well ahead of the competition. She opened a summer program for women learning ranch stewardship. It began as a handful of neighbors and grew to include widows and daughters who learned bookkeeping, hoof care, and how to read a map of land like lines of scripture. The March Marlowe household thrummed. 2 years in, the family grew. Twins, Elsie and Jude, who loved to test gravity with breakfast bowls, and a baby, Clara, who watched the world with serious brown eyes. Chaos found new forms. Oatmeal flung towards a ceiling, never so sacrosanct as when Milo's grin announced his readiness to reignite breakfast, with pancakes shaped like stars. Agnes muttered about mops and spilled oats, but her heart had been claimed completely by the small clan who took over her service. Business prospered. The Ashby order from Sacramento kept coming, and chefs wrote asking after their grass-fed cattle. Lydia's women's program began sending out graduates running their own operations, and Caleb's water cooperative extended irrigation 5 miles as engineers nodded in satisfaction. Their methods caught interest beyond territory. Men with ink-stained hands wrote requesting papers that explained their success. The March Marlowe method, conservation grazing, shared water rights, community-minded cooperatives, quietly altered a small corner of the West. They also kept a sense of levity. Milo remained their comic, the man who could spill a kettle and somehow bring tears of laughter to the rowdiest roundups. He remained the only man Caleb had ever met who could turn a mishap into art. Whatever dignity Sebastian Vale tried to salvage from his earlier fuss faded under the steady humor and competence of the new household. On a summer evening, with fireflies like slow-falling stars, Caleb and Lydia stood on the ridge, watching cattle dotting the green like ink drops. The children giggled in the grass below, chasing light. Behind them, the ranch hummed, barns lit, cattle contented, the waterworks running like a gentle throat. "We built this," Lydia said softly. "We did," Caleb agreed. "Everything from fence post to lullaby." She pressed against him. "Do you ever regret going back to town for that delivery?" Caleb considered the question. "If I'd not gone, I'd never have gotten lost at Marchwood. If I'd not been lost, I might never have found you." He looked out at their land, then at their children, and at the cooking light spilling from the kitchen where Milo sang off-key. "No regrets," he said. The loop of years turned into a legacy. Letters from distant ranchers asking for tenants at the summer school. Shipments of Marlowe beef arriving in city restaurants with notes of thanks. Neighbors who'd once squinted in suspicion, now asking for advice on water rights and business plans. The ranch gate bore the couple's double name as more than signage. It was a promise written in iron and paint. They grew older in a way that mattered, hands rougher with years of work, laughter lines deeper from joy, the sort of love that preferred real labor over dramatics. At 3 a.m, Lydia would still press fingers into his chest and whisper with a grin about the small thing that had started it all, the fence wire trick that taught her to relax enough to sleep. The last lines of their story were not an ending, but a continuation, a trail of mud leading into the yard where children built forts and a bench on the porch where an old man and his wife shared coffee as if it were a treasure. They were, in the end, exactly what they had wanted, a home brimming with laughter, a land cared for by hands that knew its faults and promises, and a love steady enough to bear the weather.